All right, thank you very much. Good morning and welcome back to this next session, session 9, citizen engagement and the state in Africa. We have just 1 hour to do this, so we'll try to be as quick as we can. But my name is Christopher Isike, Department of Political Sciences here at the University of Pretoria. We're partners of the SVNP program with the Wilson Center. I'd like to welcome you all to this session. This is very consequential that this particular session follows from the keynote address that we've just had, looking at the theme. And I think that Professor Chikwanga actually gave a good account of, kind of laid a good background on some of the problems that we face, the wicked problems, the challenges that we face in Africa. So for us, we want to try and examine citizen engagement and the states in Africa. And I think that it's important to really examine the nature of the states in Africa, because it is very central to some of the discussions we just had, the challenges, the wicked problems that Annie was talking about just now. And there has been, so scholars like Mohamed Ayub have actually articulated that the states, especially in developing regions, remain critical as the main mode of organization, right? In terms of what the state is supposed to be about. Well, it's not just only for developing regions. We have also seen historically, even in the so-called developed North, the global North, that the state plays a very important role in mobilizing, the human and material resources of states and societies, to become development-oriented, to achieve development, to achieve prosperity. And we can just simply look at the U.S. Marshall Plan that was used to help Europe to get back to itself after the Second World War, which then added a welfare component to the functions of the state, besides protection of law and order and protecting citizens from external aggression, which were the primary function of the state before then. So the state then assumed a developmental or a welfare function, after that time. But of course, this is Europe we're talking about. So the state is important, however you want to look at it. Perhaps it's a function of political systems. If you look at the United States today, you will see that the main point of difference, generally speaking, between the Democrat Party and the Republican Party is the question of how much, not whether, how much the state should be involved in people's lives. The Republican believes the state should be less present, and the Democrat believes that the state should be more present. But the question of the state being present at some level is not in doubt, right? So what is the state of the state in Africa? There have been lots of studies on the kind of state systems that Africa inherited from colonialism. And I know that even political scientists these days, talk less of those that are not political scientists, are tired of constantly blaming colonialism for the problems of the state and governance that we have in the continent. But it is also because we do not fully understand the question of the ideational essence of the state. And many studies like those of Hamza Alavi in the 70s, Bade Onimode in the 80s, Cloudake in the 2000s, and then in the 90s you had these scholars looked at the state from a political, economic point of view. William Reno, Mamadou Dia, Mahmoud Mamdani in the 90s also examined the question of the state in Africa. But let me read for you just a short comment that was made by Pierre Eglenhart and Nyang in 1996 when they wrote that the state in Africa is not a state, neither is it African, given the historical trajectories of statehood in the continent, which prevented organic state formation. Now, this is important because when I say that all of these scholars that have looked at the question of the state in Africa, and they've done a very good job of trying to make us understand the role of the state in development and in implicating it in the question of governance in the continent, the one thing they've not done, many studies have not done, apart from maybe that of Pierre Eglenhart in 1996, is the ideational essence of the state. In other words, what was the state in Africa established to achieve? What was its purpose? And what kind of governance notion, understanding of governance, does that essence, does that purpose evince, right? So as I was telling someone just now, if the state was, developed, established to be an exploitation machine, it necessarily produced an understanding of governance that was also exploitative and parasitic. And this is why it's not a question of whether our politicians think or don't read. It's a question of their failure to understand why the state exists in the first place. And the kind of that poor understanding of governance or lack of understanding of the state also produces a parasitic notion of governance. So if you see the state as an instrument to loot, then your role in the state is to enable that looting, and it informs the kind of approach you would take. And of course, we know how these have caused problems in the continent. So I'm saying that having this discussion in the context of democracy, governance, and peace building in Africa, and then also looking at the question of citizenship engagement is important, because we're beginning to see that rather than look at questions around sovereign national conference as has been proposed in Nigeria, because apart from the disruption of organic state formation in Africa, there was also the main question of the fact that many of our citizens did not participate in state making. They were not involved in forming this state. And so the question of belonging to this state and the patriotism that is supposed to evoke from that participation has been missing. So that's why we see in Nigeria, we say you put government on your shoulders. You don't carry it on your head because you can shake it off anytime because it's not yours. You don't understand it. It's alien, right? And so, but it's important that if we can't have any kind of forceful revolution or peaceful revolution, we are beginning to see citizens in the continent, especially young people, both male and female, begin to take on political inquiry, using, of course, the advantages that digitalization of politics has enabled, right? And so those are some of the things that we're going to be looking at today. This session is going to examine the nature of the African state, or the state in Africa, as I prefer to call it, and the opportunities and challenges to active citizen engagement, right? Annie talked about participation as crucial, and I think that that's useful. So we'll explore changes in citizen organizing and social movements that are disrupting the status quo in the continent. We've seen these kinds of citizenship engagement that have changed the status quo in states like Zambia. All right, we've seen that happen to some extent in Kenya. We've seen it happen to some extent in Nigeria recently. And so these are countries where there's been a change of the demography, but also the color of politics in the continent. So I have with me to actually do justice to this panel. We have the Professor Eldred Masungure. I hope I got that right. We were supposed to have Miss Eugenia Kaitesi. Unfortunately, she's not here, but we graciously, have the presence of Professor Chikwaha, who has agreed to stand in at short notice. She's already given us insights into the kind of responses she will get, so no problem. And that's why she's sitting there. But she would replace Miss Kaitesi. And then we have online, Mr. Kehinde Togun, who shall also be part of what we'll be doing. So the format for this is that I would spend about 8 minutes trying to present my initial remarks, which I've done, and I think I did that under 8 minutes. And then I will then call on each of these panelists to share their initial thoughts, on the subjects. And then each of them will have about 8 minutes. We understand that 8 minutes is not enough, for them to share what their initial thoughts will be. But we hope that during the question and answer session, we would be able to hear more from them. So in that order, it will be Professor Masungure, it will be Annie, and it will also then go to Kehinde. After their initial thoughts, I would swing back to you guys to get your thoughts, ask questions after my initial probing of some of the things that they will have to say. And then they will have 1 minute each to, give their final thoughts. And I will try and wrap this up, just trying to chat, lessons learned and way forward around some of the issues that we are going to be talking about. So, am I supposed to read their bios, or we assume that you guys have read them? You have read them? Yeah? Okay, saves us time. So you know that we have these three persons. So in that order, I would then give the opportunity to the father professor who taught Annie, and not only Annie, also taught Dr. Vuyo. He didn't teach you? Okay, all right. Sorry. Okay. Okay, so Professor, your 8 minutes starts right now.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. And good morning to you all. Yeah, I don't think one will be able to do justice in 8 minutes. But nonetheless, I have truncated, what was going to be a long presentation, on this matter, which is about looking, at citizen engagement, in the state in Africa, with particular reference, to youth engagement. And to do so using an Afro barometer lens. As I said, I had prepared a 43-slide presentation, and I realized that I was not going to, achieve the time, constraints that have been, imposed. Now, speaking about, I'm not going to talk about the state. I'm going to talk about civic and youth engagement from the perspective of, Afrobarometer. But I'm tempted to start, by making reference to to a discussion I had with the former country, World Bank country director for Zimbabwe. And that was at a time when Zimbabwe was going through, very difficult times, 1987, 1988. And Zimbabwe was being described as a failed state or even a collapsed state. And in my private conversation with him, he said, Zimbabwe, is being mischaracterized. It is not a failed state, nor is it a collapsed state. Zimbabwe is a strong but unwilling state. And that is the case, with most African states, that they are strong, but they are unwilling. The unwillingness comes from the leadership. So he was really saying it's a leadership problem. The state has the wherewithal to deliver, in terms of the public goods and services that citizens require. Now we can reflect on that, going forward. I also want, to backdrop my discussion by highlighting an area of convergence between qualitative expert surveys like surveys of elite opinion. Freedom House, for instance, Transparency International, the World Bank governance indicators, VDEM, and so on. The convergence between those kinds of studies and quantitative studies like Afrobarometer. And this is a convergence on the trend towards a democratic regression and backsliding in the last decade. But that this is not an African phenomenon. It's not a trend confined to Africa or even the global South. It's a global phenomenon. And in Africa, the latest visible evidence of that is the increasing frequency of irregular or unconstitutional changes of government, particularly in West Africa and now even in Central Africa, like in Gabon. Interestingly, I think, and for many, disturbingly, the youth are at the forefront of such pro-coup, support and pro-military rule. So it raises the question about whether we are not sometimes overstating the role, of the youth, in the democratization process. And this appears not to be associated with, or going hand in hand with a crisis of delivery, the crisis, of governance on the part of government, at a time when citizens continue to make, robust demands that are met with little or no government response. In relation to Afrobarometer, what is the state of political and civic engagement in Africa? Who gets involved in civic engagement? And what are the modes of engagement? Do governments listen to the voices of the people? And here you may remember that the motto of Afrobarometer is, let the people have a say. Are people allowed to make a say in Africa in relation to their engagement with, with the state? Now, there are various ways of civic engagement, but the most obvious and popular one is whereby citizens are given the opportunity to elect their leadership. So voting-age citizens across the generational divide, they can and often take advantage of this opportunity of engaging the state and the government. Let's take Round 9, for instance, which is being wound up in 2021, 2022. Nearly 3/4, that is 73%, of Africans, they said they had voted in their last national election. And that is an increase from 2/3 or 66% in Round 8, which was carried out between 2019 and 2021. But elections, as we all know, they are only held every 5 years. And their quality, the quality of elections is often in dispute, as was obvious, or evident, in Zimbabwe, and also in Gabon, which seemed to have triggered, the military intervention, in that country. So citizens cannot wait until elections in order to register, their aspirations, to register their preferences. They need to express themselves between elections. And the alternative ways, to elections and doing so between elections may be even more potent, even more important avenues for speaking truth to power. So how do Africans find their voice during the long intervals between elections? I think many, though admittedly still a minority, they invest in personal efforts to act as agents of change. And this brings us to civic engagement. Afrobarometer measures civic engagement in two main ways. It measures political and civic participation. Secondly, it also measures contact between citizens and their leaders. With respect to civic and the political leaders, this includes one, voting in elections. Secondly, and this is a proxy that's discussing political matters. Thirdly, attending community meetings. Fourthly, joining with others to raise an issue. And lastly, attending a protest or demonstration. And the last one is perhaps the most difficult, the most onerous, and the riskiest, in most African countries. Now, with respect to contact, with their leaders, Afrobarometer identifies, four types, of leaders. Some elected, others, appointed, or they inherit their positions. For instance, contact with traditional leaders. There's also contact with the political party officials, and then contact with elected, elected leaders like local government councillors, as well as contact with members of parliament, who are elected in elections. But across the spectrum of civic engagement activities, what we find out from the Afrobarometer surveys consistently, and more so, in recent rounds, and we define, in Afrobarometer, the youth as 18 to 35, is that they register the lowest level of participation compared, to their, elderly, compared to the middle-aged and compared to the, to the old. The middle-aged, that is 36 to about, 55, and the old, like myself, 56, plus. Further, we find that there is a significant gender balance in civic engagement, with the male youth invariably participating much more, than their, female, counterparts in terms of both the civic and the, political, participation, and also in terms of contact between, the male, the young, youth, the young, males and the female, young. The women tend to participate, much less than their male counterparts. We also have a rural, urban, divide where the rural, youth, they participate much more actively, than their urban counterparts in all these forms, or spectrums of civic and political, participation. But a damper on civic participation and civic engagement, by citizens, as reflected in Afrobarometer surveys, is the fear of government, retribution when citizens make concerns, especially, for instance, in relation to corruption. That they fear, retribution, they fear retaliation, if they report incidents, of corruption. And lastly, citizens, they report that, their leaders, especially the elected leaders, they don't listen, and the government doesn't listen. And the findings from Afrobarometer surveys are that the average assessment of MPs as listeners is about 16%, and for local government councillors is as little as 24% of respondents who say councillors, they listen often, or always. And therefore, there is a lack of government responsiveness. There's a lack of government respect, for popular voices, for popular, expressions, of concerns, by citizens, and that results, in a state, that is impervious, to the interests and concerns, of the citizens, including, the youth who participate the least amongst the various age groups. And therefore, we can conclude that responsive and respectable governance can be a spur to civic engagement, to civic participation, and can be an avenue for dealing with critical development challenges. And therefore, civic participation, civic engagement can be that antidote that is required in order to rescue democratic development, and to ensure that this equilibrium between demand and supply is addressed, and the state is strengthened in terms of its capacities and in terms of its willingness to deliver the things that are valued by citizens. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. He has been able to articulate a few points to us in terms of who engages, what modes of engagement they use, and the question of whether government listens or not. The one question, Professor, that I would want you to think about, maybe before we get questions from the audience, is what citizen perspectives are, in Africa, from your findings in Afrobarometer. What are the perspectives of citizens towards democracy, governance, and peace building? Just, a short answer on that, but I'm not going to ask you now. Let me pose a question to Annie, and it will be for you to talk about age, gender, and economic dynamics that present opportunities and challenges to active citizen engagement in the states in Africa. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, thank you, Chair. My thoughts on that, I think I will speak on what I think are the challenges a lot more regarding citizen engagement in Africa from the perspective of regional actors and at the regional level. Why? Because just as I was listening to Prof. Masunungure, I noticed that, okay, we have a lot of information on what happens at the national level, and whereas there may be challenges at the national level, it is easier for social movements, to form, erupt at the national level than it is for that to happen at the regional level. And yet at the regional level, there remains a disconnect, because that is where the policies that create this environment that makes all these things possible, that make it possible to create space for including women, for including young people, in governance and in economic management. All those issues is articulated at the AU level. And when we start by looking at the A level itself and the spaces that it itself has created for citizen engagement, this becomes important because it shows us exactly what then is the overall state of this in the entire region, and how then does this play out at the national level. We know that the AU, for reasons best known to diplomats, I guess, the AU has always had a very institutionalized approach to citizen engagement. Initially it was formulated through the ECOSOC, but nothing ever really happened. And then when the African governance architecture came into being, it had a slow evolution after the ASDEG in 2007, etc. And when it eventually came into fruition, it had this platform, the African Governance Platform. And it is through the Governance African Platform that African citizens can engage with the African Union. You can see it is a very formalized structure, which means the agenda and the themes are already set and decided on. And though it is an open space, the African Governance Platform for CSOs, etc. When you look at all past events, of the AGA, the African Governance Architecture, you find that it is specific usual suspects that are recognized as members in the African Governance Platform. Everybody is somehow expected to find their way into these that are at the center of inputting into governance policies through the African Governance Platform. So to begin with, the whole issue of formalized structuring to citizen engagement doesn't work well for Africa, because it leaves a lot of citizens and a lot of actors, a lot of themes, they are marginalized, they are on the periphery, and they can only be looking on from the outside forever. Because for them to be working with this organization that is specifically working on youth employment initiatives, and yet you are an environment youth group, or you are in, say, a peace-building youth group, you will not find space easily in these that have been accepted or that go to the table. And secondly, going to that African Governance Platform table itself, you have to be resourced. You have to have financial resources to be able to engage. And a lot of youth, especially, and women's organizations, they don't have that kind of resources. It is not in the nature of African philanthropists, if they exist, to fund such things. In any case, even if they want to, like in my country, if you fund that, you have a political agenda. You can't go around funding youth groups and women's groups. You are seeking political office. So already you sanction yourself. You can't finance these things. So we only have development partners who are financing these issues. And those funders, welcome as they are, they also have to have things that are done in line with their agenda and their themes. Remember, they are also accountable to their own taxpayers. So if they decide this year we are looking at youth and climate change, then that's it. You have to fit into that category, else there's no funding. So CSOs or activists, etc., citizens, those groups that represent citizens, they are constantly figuring out ways of mutating to meet the needs of these development partners so they can fit in, so they can engage for policy purposes with the African bodies. And already you can see they are engaging from the wrong side of the railway line, to say, I think, because they must be framing a specific agenda that their funder has paid for, and only then will they be able to travel or make input, etc. We do not necessarily have that culture of people submitting written submissions, policy papers. We don't do that, as a practice. We used to do that a lot in the ISS. And I remember working in Addis Ababa, we were called troublemakers, and this, you ruffle feathers, you want to be in the middle of things, not everybody was happy with that. Secondly, you also need to have resources, what do I call them? Intellectual resources or knowledge resources. You need to have that information that gives you that place at the table. You need to speak to something concrete, that you have researched, that you have evidence on. And not many of our youth groups or women's groups have that luxury of conducting research or collecting evidence or anything. They just go there with their lived experiences, period. They are not going to be able to amass information and document this and that and then go and confront these people with a specific position that's already taken, that has been informed by their research. So already there are two cruel blows here, financial resources and knowledge resources. And both come from the same development partners. They fund your research as well, in addition to funding your engagements as well. And so to begin with, for non-state actors, it is very difficult to engage with these regional bodies. If we go to the SADC level, it's the same issue. SADC is worse than the African Union. It is very, very formalized. To engage with SADC, you have to have an MOU for non-state actors. And in this group of people with MOUs, I think for the last 20 years, there have only been 3 organizations. One, representing churches, 1 trade unions, 1 like an umbrella organizations of NGOs. That's it. And that's why when I spoke about the youth, I said the youth made a lot of noise because they were tweeting and speaking to the agenda they want on the table. So in that way, they were able to shape the agenda because SADC couldn't ignore them, They would make a lot of noise when they're sending out their tweets. You know how it's fashionable these days for everybody conferencing to send out that stuff. They would respond and, hijack the whole agenda from them. So it became necessary to take them on board. And surprisingly, since they got on board, they are such a quiescent youth. They don't make as much, attention, to be polite. They don't talk as much as they used to. But before, it's like they were captured. They've joined the system. And yet, when you look at what it is they do there, they are recognized and invited to ceremonial events, not to the policy-making platforms within SADC itself. And so, citizens, youth, women, men, everybody has remained, on the margins of SADC. There is really no willingness to engage with citizens there. If you want to engage with SADC, they send you to their national directorates. There are national directorates in each country. They send you to the national directorates. And there, the desks are unmanned. Because the governments, do you think Zimbabwe would want to have a desk officer for SADC right now? They are unmanned, so there's nowhere to go. So you remain frustrated. You can make input into regional policy issues, which then will be easier for you to go back to your country and say, hey, you signed up for this, therefore we are holding you to account to comply with these provisions and protocols and norms, etc., standards that you have signed up for with the regional bodies. So that doesn't happen. And this, I think, has left the women a lot in limbo, largely confined with livelihood issues. The youth have been pushing a lot on employment issues, and that is one reason that the SADC took them on board. And I noticed when SADC accepted SAYOK, it was just after the insurgency started in Mozambique, and there were a lot of Mozambican youth, activists as well on the platform. So it was necessary to pay attention to the issues. Okay, I'll stop here. However, lastly, on the engagement modalities themselves at this level, I think we also need to ask ourselves on the quality of engagements that take place. What does this hierarchy look like here? In my opinion, and from what I've seen, it's a lot of just information, acknowledging them, informing them, and acknowledging them. Sometimes they are consulted in a way that they are being told what has been decided on. So it's not like there's any significant input as such. And at most, it's just placation. Thank you. Sorry for taking long.
All right. Thank you very much. I think now I understand why sometimes politicians like to centralize power. Because if I had Annie here, she would have been looking at me. So decentralization sometimes doesn't help. But thank you very much for this. I think what she has done is mainly, like she said, to talk about the challenges of youth engagement or citizen engagement with the state. She mentioned the fact that the one opportunity you did mention was that the structural architecture, for instance, in SADC, but in itself, it also has challenges. As for instance, these are not the structure is not clearly communicated. She talked about resources to engage, both financial and knowledge, that are missing. The question of who defines the agenda, and the last point around tokenism. When people get there, they forget why they were, what they were about in the first place. Let's in the next round, and I want you to think about the opportunities and that things like digitalization presents to young people, what are the opportunities for, citizen engagement that currently exist in the continent? I know the challenges are many, but are there opportunities for citizens to engage more, for instance, through digital platforms and what that is doing to, revolutionizing, politics and at least electoral outcomes, as one measure. So something to think about. But we'll now go straight to our next panelist, and I hope that even though he's in the United States, I see that he's not a professor, so I'm sure that he'll keep to 8 minutes. Professors tend to talk too much, including myself, by the way. So hopefully Mr. Togun keeps to 8 minutes, and his time starts now.
Well, thank you. I probably will keep under 8 minutes. Many thanks to the Wilson Center, the Africa program at the Wilson Center, and the Institute for Security Studies for having me. It's great to see all of you in the room, and I'm sorry that I'm not there physically to be there right now. I very much agree with much of what has been said so far. And I think in opening and for framing for me, I want to say, use the words of my friend at ISS, Dr. Fonte Akun. Fonte often reminds us that as much as governance is important, African agency is the name of the game. More specifically, as much as we should make sure that African leaders follow the demands of their people, and we should encourage people to make those demands, African citizens must take up space in their countries, in the region, and on the global stage. And our leaders, speaking for us, must do the same, but do so with credibility. And so I suggest that Africa's democracy is only possible when we are agents of our own destiny, and when our leaders and the African state recognize this agency and use it to channel our needs and our demands. Stepping back, I think it's worth noting that as we think about the state of the African continent, there are some bright spots. For example, we saw many African leaders decide not to get sucked into the competition between China, Russia, and the United States, even while many of them acknowledge the values of self-determination, which is what Ukraine's primary argument has been. We also saw the United States host an Africa Leaders Summit, where Africans demanded their space on the global stage, and for a week, Africa essentially took over Washington, D.C. Yet trouble persists. Recent elections in Zimbabwe and in Nigeria should give us pause, and of course, Gabon. And the increasing coups on the continent are a symptom of greater problems. Climate change is driving insecurity, and insecurity is manifesting as extremism in many parts of the region. Some of these issues have been discussed by my fellow panelists, but I want to focus on the role of African civil society, the role that African civil society has played and can play in fortifying democracy on the continent. Over time, we have both seen organized and diffused civil society make positive things happen on the continent. In Nigeria a few years ago, we saw the End SARS movement galvanize young people. In Sudan, we saw citizens rise to topple a dictator. Unfortunately, these wins have not been durable, but I submit that African governments have to do more to create the space for civil society to thrive. A few months ago, I was in Arusha for the Africa Drive for Democracy. There was a rich conversation about whether democracy is right for the continent. Some pockets of individuals argued that democracy is not African. However, a majority rightly pointed out the fallacy of this thinking. The tenets of democracy, such as rule of law, the viability of our institutions, are all concepts that Africans want and need in order to succeed. Several folks have remarked to me over time that Africa is having a moment on the global stage. The Biden administration released an Africa strategy, and as I mentioned, hosted an entire summit here for the continent. The G20 also just invited the African Union to join the body. But for these events to be meaningful, and for this moment to be more than fleeting, the African state must create conditions for civil society. Otherwise, we must ask who or what is the AU representing in that body? And to be meaningful, this looks like allowing registration of NGOs to be a lot easier. It looks like ending the criminalization of LGBT populations or other marginalized groups whose existence have been called into question. It also looks like refraining from passing NGO laws that are actually quite anti-NGO, and supporting the principles of freedom of information and open government, and seeing quality journalism as necessary, not as a nuisance that must be squashed. In the same token, civil society has its own part to play, and we must do better and be better about calling ourselves to order. In many African countries, civil society can be better representatives of citizens, not just be a vehicle for elite capture. For example, one of the most interesting things in observing diffuse social movements is the divide between civil resistors and quote unquote professional civil society. There's this perception that professional NGOs don't represent the people, or at least no longer have the credibility to be voices of the people. In reality, though, this outside and inside dichotomy could actually be beneficial. Civil resistors and activists on the street can help create conditions for NGO leaders who have relationships deep inside with insiders to push for meaningful change. However, until and unless we decide we're on the same team, the ability of governments to ably divide and conquer will only increase. Similarly, journalism, the fourth estate, must be considered sacred. However, professional standards of journalism have to increase. What independent media does and how it acts reverberates and can either engender trust or amplify the apathy that many Africans already feel. So in summation, I offer that a vibrant civil society is crucial to the African state's success. When African civil society meaningfully and ably represents their constituents, and when governments listen to the demands of the African civil society, we can begin to see the dividends that are much needed on our continent. I'll stop here for the sake of time, but I look forward to a conversation with my esteemed colleagues and with the folks who are in the audience. Thank you, Dr. Sike.
Thank you very much. You remember what I said about professors, right? So yeah, that's it. I think he said to us that, citizen agency is important, and that civil society do have a role to play in, enabling or consolidating democracy in the continent. So I would want to throw it open now to us because we have very limited time. So you already have your first set of questions, Professor and Prof, from me. But let's get any of you ask questions around, what you have heard, and then we would get them to respond. Are there any questions from the audience? I see one, I see two, and three. I would have been surprised if you didn't raise your hand, Professor Genga. All right.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentations. My question goes to Prof, actually, because I just want to hear his view concerning social media. Because I was expecting that probably, youth engagement should be, should actually be measured through social media because they are much more likely to use the tool. And, if you see the trend for the election in Africa largely, including Zimbabwe and Nigeria, you see the preference for a given candidate on social media than the traditional politicians. And the traditional politician tends to fear the social media more because they know the youth are always there. So also, because of the demographic, Prof belongs to a given age range. So, I just want to hear his view largely. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, you didn't identify which of the professors you had. Okay, I get it. Okay, great. Second?
Thank you very much. My question goes to Prof. Eldred too. Prof, thank you very much for the presentation. You elaborated much more on the modes of engagement by the youth and the leaders. I would like to hear more about the substance of engagement in terms of key issues, priority issues. I'm saying this because a recent study in Rwanda, for instance, by the USAID shows that the priority of young people are elsewhere compared to where the government has concentrated efforts. They said reconciliation is not our priority because we weren't there when we were killing each other. They were very much interested in employment, development of skills, and access to financial schemes. So I would like to, since the Afrobarometer is a quantitative study, if you have a certain ranking in terms of key issues on which they engage leaders. Thank you.
Thank you. Mine is not really a question, but a reflection. I agree with the last speaker on creating a conducive environment for the NGOs to thrive, through where the state does that. But oftenly we've seen the state doing the opposite. Like in Kenya today, we have the government ordering all NGOs to comply with the bottom-up agenda. And apparently there is an agenda in the bottom-up idea of the state, but that does not include NGOs that put the state to task when it comes to maybe things like human rights and all that. So you wonder how they're supposed to transform into this agenda, yet they're the ones calling off the wrong things that the state is doing. So that is actually essentially muzzling the civil society space to hold government accountable.
Okay, so the first question was on social media. You want to clarify your question to Prof? He didn't quite get it.
I want to hear his reflections around youth and social media, firstly, and then whether Afrobarometer is actually capturing social media, as part of the youth engagement.
Okay, thanks. So most of the questions went to you, so you want to start?
Okay, thank you. I think the first question was, from yourself about the perspectives of the youth, on governance issues. It is clear that the youth throughout Africa, they do have robust support for various forms of democracy. But particularly, with respect to elections, they support elections, but they are deeply worried by the quality, of elections. Elections, they do not give them, the avenue, the opportunity, to, express themselves in terms of choosing the leaders that they want. They think that they are restricted through various mechanisms that the state or the leadership deploys. For instance, disenfranchisement, which is a big problem in Zimbabwe, and I'm sure in Gabon as well, and other countries. I think Nigeria was in the limelight for its elections in February. So they support various elements of the package of democratic norms, including term limits across all 36 Afrobarometer countries. There is strong support for term limits, which they regard as a measure that ensures that political leaders do what the citizens want and do not abuse power during their 2 terms in office. And they also want the executive to be accountable to various institutions, for instance, parliamentary oversight, over the executive, and that the executive should subject itself, to the decisions, of the courts. So even when they do support, robustly, democratic, tenets, they are unhappy with the extent of democracy in various in various countries. So that discrepancy between their expectations and the reality on the ground is a matter of serious concern, and we see that in their assessments of the country direction. In the last round, 36 countries that have so far been, covered, because Afrobarometer is completing the round 9, surveys. Of the 36 countries, 29 out of 36 had citizens saying the country is going in the wrong direction. Only in 7 countries, do citizens feel that the country is going in the right direction. And I think that is an indication of the dissatisfaction, of citizens with the nature of governance, in their country. And you can relate that, to the massive, migration trends, in Africa, that they find their country more or less uninhabitable. And the migration, is a measure of the habitability of the countries, where they are staying. Regarding, the substance of engagement, across the board, in all countries, for the youth and indeed for all citizens, employment is a major problem. I don't think Afrobarometer has yet started operating in Rwanda. But if that was, to be done, I think employment will also rank among, at the top of the hierarchy of problems that citizens, feel they needs to be addressed. In Zimbabwe, a problem that has emerged, in recent years, and that is filtering in the Afrobarometer surveys, is the abuse of the drug abuse problem. It was never there, in previous rounds. Even in round 8, it was not there. And in the last pre-election survey that we carried out in May, in Zimbabwe this year, drugs shot up from nowhere to, I think it was number 6. So that's one of the hierarchy of needs. Then economic empowerment. Both the youth and and the elders, they regard the economic empowerment as an important it's an important dimension of what they want. And in Zimbabwe's case, I think the migration of supporters from the opposition, which has happened in recent years, that migration from the opposite to the ruling party is in part because of the strong empowerment policies of the ruling party. What else?
Annie, you want to just respond? You didn't have any question, did you? No, I have no question. Mine. Okay, just answer that. And if that guy comes back, I would be standing next to you.
Okay. Well, on opportunities, for me, the one thing that stands out most, the best opportunity arises from the spontaneity that is brought in by digitalization, the whole range of these fourth industrial revolution technologies. This makes it enabled to transcend space, in real time and events as well. There's nothing you can't do digitally, You can participate in politics in every way, including voting, right? In other countries, they can vote digitally. You can demand transparency by, whistle blowing or, recording information and publicity. As you have seen, everybody's now a journalist, just like everybody's now an actress or an actor. Also, you can demand accountability, constant noise hammering on what is going wrong, a mining venture that is gone off the tracks or some Chinese investment that is not working well, stuff like that. All this information is relayed, in real time in a lot of the cases, and you obviously end up getting officials responding, to try and contain the situation. The second opportunity comes from networking. Networking, I think, is a great resource for cash-stricken civil society organizations, and not long-term standing networks, but even ad hoc networks that just come up for a specific purpose, address the issue, and then disband and leave just a small secretariat or a small group to go on with the issue. And I think this kind of what we can call network social movements, they also present a great opportunity. And lastly, the innovation hubs that are coming up left, right, and center from the private sector, I think they are also taking away a lot of what the government sort of thought was its preserve, creating employment. So we see a lot of even young Black people stepping into that zone as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Is Mr. Togun back? So we can ask him. Does he hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. So, Mr. Togun, I hear you have to leave. Sorry about that. So you have 1 minute to give your closing remarks. But as you do so, I also want you to consider giving us 1 or 2 practical recommendations around how civil society can be more useful in enabling democratization in Africa.
Thank you, Dr. Saket, and apologies for having to leave early. So I think I would actually come back to the question around social media, because I do think that there's something here around how we engage young people. I think that there's a bit of a thing of how do we make sure that social media is not conflated with citizen participation. Young people want to be active, and they've chosen that vehicle as a mode of engagement. And so how do we move that from the Twitter streets to the actual streets and offices, I think is an important thing for civil society leaders to consider, of how do we make sure that we are actively engaging people, not just getting them to shout and say things online, but not actually participate. So I think that's one thing for civil society actors to think about. I think the other thing I would say is, again, coming back to the role of the state. And I appreciate my Kenyan brother and your point of how this idea of government wanting to co-opt civil society is a thing that we need to be mindful of. How do we make sure that as civil society actors, we are not allowing ourselves to be tools and actually pushing back? I think this idea of pushing back and being a real certainly antagonizers as necessary, collaborators also when necessary, but I think being conscious of when we're playing which role and doing so proactively is important for all of us. So I will pause there. And again, thank you for having me, and apologies for having to leave early.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Togun, and enjoy the rest of your day. So we've had answers from our panelists who are here, so just two of them here now. How much time do we have before we close? Done. All right. So I guess I would just try and wrap this up by first of all thanking our panelists, those who are present here, and Mr. Togun, who has just left. I think that essentially we've had very useful discussions, though limited in some ways. But for me, you know, the one question that has probably not been answered and will not have time for is the question of how to engage with a state that we depend on to facilitate or provide an enabling environment for change, for citizen engagement, but does not do so because of its own vested self-interest. So, for instance, in Nigeria, if you look at the case of Nigeria, there's a lot of unhappiness around, you know, the election tribunal and its result, which many people depended on to be a mediator in the elections, but now turned out not to have given the kind of judgment that people expected, whether rightly or wrongly. The question is, what opportunities for peaceful change exist? You know, especially in a state system that is, you know, organized to prevent any meaningful change because of the vested interests of politicians. What should young people that are increasingly showing interest in politics, you know, changing political inquiry, the character of political inquiry in the continent, what options remain for them to engage if the state it keeps on frustrating their peaceful efforts to try and bring about change? What should they do? Should they continue that peaceful path and hope that one day God will somehow touch these politicians to change how they do business? Or should they, you know, take it in their own hands, whatever that means? You know, this is a safe space, it's a university, academic freedom to say whatever I want to say. How you interpret it is up to you. I cannot be taken to court if you think that I've said youth should go on the streets and just simply take over government. But that's a question. That's something that we should leave in our hearts as we close. And on this note, I want you to have that as food for thought, but also enjoy food for your stomach this afternoon. Thank you. Thank you very much for being part of the session.